In this video, we're going to take a look at two different cameras and discuss if upgrading to a full-blown cinema camera is worth the money. Over the past 6 years, I've been slowly building up my skill and equipment to a point where I can confidently say to clients that what I have to offer is worth your consideration and money. There are lots of these types of videos already out there to find, and I feel that the question has been well answered many times over, but what I aim to achieve today with this video is my specific view on this debate and talk a little bit of shop about the camera package that I ultimately decided to go for, the Zcam E2 M4. If you'd like to skip the ideology talk and just see the comparison between the entry-level gear and professional equipment, feel free to jump to this time code here or use the chapters on the side. Without further ado, let's begin. Now, the first thing I feel always needs covered when you're talking about the subject of gear is this: is having gear required to make good content or make progressions in your career? My answer to this is simple. It is not necessary, but it sure can help if you know how to use it. Over the years, I believe that having the biggest camera equated to the best quality of work. The truth of the matter, though, as I'm sure you've heard by now, is that gear doesn't matter nearly as much as having a good story, or, to go with something a little bit less cliche, having an interesting subject matter. Some of my best work has been shot on entry-level gear with the help of friends and no budget whatsoever. The camera isn't what made those things great. If you keep asking yourself what you need to get started with what you have. As you begin with the process, what is lacking in your toolkit will become clearer to you, and you can plan to upgrade on into that. Now, to go back to my original statement, here's the flip side of that, where gear may become of importance to you. To use an analogy to demonstrate this point, let's just say you're a chef trying to get a job at a 5-star restaurant. You may be very successful cooking for yourself and your friends using nothing more than your paring knife, a cutting board, and your innate knowledge of how flavors combine to make a beautiful dish. But if you wish to step up to the big leagues, investing in your success by filling out your chef's roll of knives a little bit more may be the barrier to entry. Yes, you can make delicious foods with the most basic of tools, but delicious food isn't the only requirement in the top echelon of the restaurant world. You have to deliver an aesthetic. You need to be able to do more things that your single knife can't accomplish alone. Your skills need to expand to accommodate all this newfound requirement that you have to fulfill. In the end, sometimes looking the part is the only way to get where you want to go, because that's what the industry demands. This is the same in the filmmaking world. An iPhone is just as capable of making moving and stunning visuals as any of the best cameras are. Industry professionals and content creators alike have proven this to be true. But if where you want to work is in the top level of clientele where the amount of money they spend on funding your commercial for them is a drop in the bucket, sometimes your gear needs to support that. Yes, everything that big cameras can do, small ones could do, and sometimes they can do it better. But the image of having a bigger rig, so to speak, sometimes gives an image of professionalism that people subconsciously think about, but don't necessarily want to admit. Now, this shouldn't discourage you either. It takes a long time for you to get to the point where the gear is a constraining factor from you getting work. In fact, I'm not even to that point in my career yet. I've shot everything I've done for the past 6 years on the first camera I got as a gift from my parents, and that's gotten me a sustainable career position that I'm at today. But for me personally, I look at this move that I have made into this new camera as filling out my chef's roll of knives in preparation for the next step in my career. I've mastered what my current equipment is capable of. Now it's time to take the next step towards the 5-star restaurant. Alright, soapbox time over. Now let's get to brass tacks. The two cameras I'll be comparing are my Nikon D3400 and my Zcam E2 M4. Running across the screen now are the headline figures that you'll need to know about each of these cameras. Obviously, from a specs perspective, these two are not a fair fight, but the results when shooting the two comparably were closer than I would have guessed at first. So, to begin, let's talk about the Nikon. The Nikon camera is very clearly a photography-focused camera with some pretty good video capabilities for the time it was released. This is really accentuated by the fact that it doesn't even have a microphone jack for an external microphone. It has a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor that can shoot 1080p and 60 frames per second for $500. Full HD with a 60 frames per second option is incredibly good to start off with, because this gives you the option to shoot slow motion video without spending a ton of money on high-end cameras or relying on the super slow motion capabilities of your phone, which, to be honest, are not professional quality. It has a focal multiplier of 1.5 times, which in layman's terms means that every lens is going to be 1.5 times tighter than what a full-frame sensor would see. So if you put, let's say, a 35mm lens on an APS-C sensor, the focal distance is equivalent to what would be a 50mm on a full-frame camera. There's plenty of videos that dive deeper into this subject and the technicalities of it, but that's not what we're talking about today. I just thought this would be important because of a point I'm going to make later about it. The two kit lenses that I have are great for photography, but really aren't suitable for video work unless you're outside or in a really bright room. So I picked up an f1.8 35mm lens for $180, and that really opened up the possibilities for good footage with this camera. This lens gave me the ability to shoot in any environment without the worry of being woefully underexposed. After I got this lens is where I kind of went down a rabbit hole of buying more and more gears and accessories to unlock even more capabilities out of this camera. An entry-level body that shoots slow-mo HD paired with a gimbal, a follow focus, and a variable neutral density filter can get you footage that would rival any YouTube content creator. The most important thing about this setup is that you have to use manual controls to get the exposure you want. While this camera does have automatic features to control every aspect of the camera's settings down from focus, ISO, and aperture, they make the footage and the audio entirely unusable. As a tool for learning though, this camera is really great, as I found the menus aren't too confusing to navigate if you know what you're looking for, and the settings to change are minimal, so that keeps the learning curve pretty low. As you've seen from some of this footage, the results are not bad. They are quite passable, and a lot of people would hire you for this quality of footage. It ultimately comes down to the skill of the user and knowing what your tool is capable of. Now let's move on to the Z-Cam and why I chose this over other options that are in its price bracket. As I've started to step up in my productions, the go-to camera choice for up-and-coming cinematographers and filmmakers I've felt has either been the Sony a7S III or the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Sony being the go-to choice for YouTubers and Blackmagic being the choice for people who want to make movies. Obviously that's just a generalization, either tool is good for either discipline, that just seems to be the general trend at the moment. The reason I chose a different path than either of these really two good options came down to three reasons for me: price, performance, and size. Starting with price at $1,500 for a body, it's a bit more than the Blackmagic and a slam dunk under what the Sony is offering. But where the Z-Cam and the Blackmagic differ from the Sony, and the reason I put them in the same price category, is in their classification as cinema cameras. Unlike the Sony, you can't just shoot with these cameras straight out of the box. The Z-Cam doesn't even come with a battery out of the box. Accessories are a necessary part to make these cameras function. I'll jump more into that later, but to get either of those cameras fully operational takes around $1,000 minimum in accessories, and you can spend well above that for different functionalities. So it's about a wash in price at about $2,500-ish to make either of these cameras usable. All in, I paid about $2,900 for the setup on my Z-Cam as it currently stands, not including the gear that I already had accumulated from my previous camera. Moving on to the performance is where this camera starts to pull ahead a bit. All of these cameras can shoot 4K log profiles, with the cinema cameras shooting a little bit of extra horizontal coverage at 4096 pixels versus 3840 pixels on the Sony. The Sony and Blackmagic can both shoot 4K 120 frames per second, while the Z-Cam maxes out at 4K 160 frames per second. Now, to get into the technicalities, this isn't true 4K. It's a little bit downsized 4K to get that frames per second, but it can do it, so I'm counting it. That's not significantly more than 120 frames, but it could make a difference in some scenarios where you really need that high frame rate. Blackmagic has the best codec, in my opinion, for editing with after the fact with their B-RAW codec. It is very user-friendly in Resolve or in Premiere. No matter what you're using, it has a lot of controls and it has a lot of room to play with after the fact. While Z-Cam has their own compressed RAW codec called Z-RAW, very original. However, from what I've read, this RAW codec isn't really compatible with any editing software like Blackmagic's is yet, so I haven't tested its capabilities. However, All three cameras can shoot 422 ProRes RAW, which has plenty of room to work with in post. So in the end, resolution and codecs is kind of a wash for all three of this as well, as unless you are at the top level making commercial level stuff, you're not going to be shooting in the full RAW capabilities of Blackmagic anyway. ProRes RAW in 422 or ProRes RAW, not even 422, is more than likely going to be more than enough for what you're going to be shooting on the day-to-day. In the end, that brings us down to size, and that is the real reason that this camera stuck out among the others for me. Because of its small size and its cube shape, it's definitely the easiest to mount to different rigs. The Blackmagic is notoriously difficult to balance on a gimbal. It is quite heavy after a full day's use because a V-mount or a bigger battery solution is a necessary addition to make that camera work. With the Z-Cam, a single NPF battery I bought off Amazon for 30 bucks lasted me an entire 16-hour shoot day, only losing battery on our last shot of the day. And with no cage on it, it balances on a gimbal really easily. So for that reason primarily, I chose the Z-Cam. Now the part of the video that I'm most curious about, the side-by-side test. To be honest, upon first look of the footage, I was surprised with how close the two images looked. The foreground elements, when in focus, are perfectly sharp and readable between both cameras. The depth of field is going to be shallower on the Nikon because I had my f1.8 35mm prime lens on it versus an f3.5 14-150mm on the Z-Cam. Where the differences lie, I noticed immediately, is in the fine details in the compression. Look at the lines on the siding of the house for a clear example on how the compression of the Nikon loses information with its H.264 codec. Granted, I shot the Z-Cam in 4K for this test, but even downscaled from 4K to HD, the detail is much more present in this footage. However, here's the biggest downside that I noticed immediately with shooting the Z-Cam, and that is the shake and the micro jitters. The Z-Cam M4 uses what's called a micro four thirds sensor, same as what you get on a Blackmagic 4K. Now, whenever I've been on a project where a Blackmagic Pocket was being used, the DP usually had the camera set up with a speed booster and converted to EF lenses. I really didn't understand why this was the case. I always thought that micro four thirds lenses were pretty decent until I was holding it myself, and I understood immediately why they make this modification. Where the APS-C lens has a focal multiplier of 1.5 times on the Nikon camera, the micro four thirds sensor camera in the Z-Cam has a multiplier of 2 times, so 50mm equals 50mm on a full frame, 50mm equals 35mm on an APS-C sensor, and 50mm equals 25mm on a micro four thirds sensor. What that ultimately translates to with the lens that I chose is a lot of micro jitters if you try to shoot handheld in any focal distance beyond 25mm. So perhaps a speed booster will be the next knife in my chef's roll, or maybe it'll be a nice prime 25mm lens. Undecided at this time. Until then, as a note to everyone else who's considering running this setup, a gimbal or a tripod is a must if you can manage to have one of those for your shoots. If you can't, then shoot as wide as your lens will allow for. Overall though, I'm very happy with how the footage looks. As mentioned, the form factor for shooting videos is unmatched by its competitors in my opinion, and it has the best usable performance at a very reasonable price by comparison to the other offerings in this arena. So in conclusion, here's what I have to say about the whole gear debate. If you want to make videos and you've never shot anything before, then stop watching videos about making videos and get out there and make something. That way you have a baseline. If you have an entry-level camera like the Nikon that I do, and you feel like you've exhausted its capabilities, try incrementally growing your gear up with pieces that you can use for your next camera. And think smart on it. Gimbals are becoming cheaper and cheaper by the day. Maybe pick one up and learn how to do new moves and add interesting dynamics to your videos. Maybe pick up a variable neutral density filter that fits your lens so you have another level of control of the light coming into your camera. Maybe pick up an external monitor so you can move your screen to different angles and you can put the camera in new places and still see what you're doing. You get the idea. Do it small, do it in stages, and do it smart. If you're past all that and are ready to step up into the world of paid videography, then I think the Z-Cam is a great gateway into that world. In fact, the footage that I've been showing you throughout this video is footage for an unreleased documentary that I've been camera operating for in my local area, so stay tuned to hear about that some other time. That just about covers it all. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you very much for watching. It means a lot to me. If you'd like to see more content like this talking about the philosophy of creating moving images of any kind, I'd love to dive deeper into it. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.